It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.
And that's Jim Delbridge, of course, with 5 to 7. Welcome to the latest episode of Islands at War with me, Keith Pengelly, and also with
Nick Lahiro. Morning, Keith.
Morning, Nick. So we're recording this one Sunday morning here in Guernsey. The rain is absolutely sheeting down, but we're nice and snug in the studio.
Indeed.
Okay, so we're talking about February 1943 in this episode, and the big talking point is the second wave of deportations that took place across the Channel Islands. There had been deportations in September 1942, but we now want to talk about what took place in 1943 because the impetus driving force behind it seemed to be completely different, Nick, didn't it?
It's probably worth mentioning, actually, that at the date of recording this in September 2025, last week was the 81st anniversary of the first round of deportations in September. Sorry, not 81st. Well, I can't count. 83rd.
Yeah.
I can't count today. It's I've been up to all sorts this weekend in terms of tours and things, and I'm
all toured out.
My brain's in about 5 different directions trying to think through. So yeah, it was the anniversary of the September 42 deportations was last week. But as you say, we talked about in the January 43 episodes, we talked about deportations, and now they're actually about to happen. They're imminent, and they are driven by...
Well, yes, this is what I wanted specifically to talk to you about, because whereas the 1942 deportations were sort of a driven by Hitler, I think we could say,
yep, absolutely.
And events we discussed at the time, here it seems, looking into this and deriving information from the diarists that we mine, it seems, Nick, to be driven by a certain General Lieutenant Muller, not by the civil commandantur as previously we saw in September 42. So Muller seems to be driving this on a personal basis, and his, I don't know if one would say he's Benoit Nakfus, General Nakfus?
No, Colonel
Nakfus, thank you. He actually went to Paris in order to try and get these deportations either diminished or stopped altogether. So, Nick, tell us a little bit about this chap Muller.
Okay, so these deportations came around predominantly as a result of basalt. So there were various orders floating around coming from outside of the island. So it's not entirely driven by Muller, but it is Muller that's really pushing this forward. As we mentioned in the January episodes, the notices that go in the paper are noticeable by their absence of anybody's name. When they're saying they're going to deport somebody, in certain classes of people, the notice in the paper is they're very, I don't know, shy about signing them. They're never shy about signing any of their notices. So that just tells you one thing, and it's clear that some of those in the military authorities here, be it the Feldkommandantur, so that's the lot that are responsible for the civilian aspects of the occupation, or actually the German military authorities, that some of them are less keen on being associated with deporting British nationals from the Channel Islands to Germany, because they've got one eye on the fact that things aren't going so well for the Germans, shall we say, in the war, and they're thinking, well, we might not win this. In fact, actually, Nakfus gets into trouble later on for anti-German commentary, but we'll come to that in a moment. So, General Erich Muller, who was he? Muller was the most powerful man in the Channel Islands, May 1941 to September 43, head of the military, overseeing all the islands, and obviously, there were island commandants as well, but he was responsible for the lot. And he was born in 1889, joined the army in 1909, and had been in the army ever since. Now, he was a less than agreeable personality from all accounts. He was feared by his own troops and was a pedantic slave driver, and when it came to his men. In fact, Muller was one of the few people, and so was Nakfus, to be fair, that the Jersey authorities got them classified as war criminals.
And that was from Jersey only.
Well, I think Jersey did all the work related to it.
Yeah.
Alex Coutange, the bailiff of Jersey, wrote quite a lot of notes towards the back end of the occupation, which he could have potentially got into a lot of trouble for, about these two individuals. And I've seen document when I went to the National Archives recently, by the end of 1945, the British government has agreed that they are war criminals for their treatment of Channel Islanders, and they agree that they're going to be pursued. But as with many of those who committed war crimes, they were never actually brought to justice for it, predominantly because there were so many that were on the lists of war criminals. It tended to be only the high-profile ones that ended up being prosecuted, because it took so long, and by 1947 the will had just run out. So Muller dies 1956, faces no consequences of what he's done. Nakfus does make out, you're right, and I think this is going back to one eye on things aren't going quite so great. Nakfus does make representations to try and stop islanders from being deported, goes to Paris, sort of makes himself out to be a good guy. This is probably partly why in 1944 he ends up getting court-martialed for anti-German statements and is taken away from the islands and sent to the Eastern Front for some period of time. Muller, I should mention, actually ended up on the Eastern Front after he left in September 1943, and then was posted back to Normandy in charge of a unit there in 1944. So Nakfus got booted out of Jersey 2nd of March 1944 to face trial over defeatist remarks. So I suspect for Nakfus, the reason he was protesting against these things and didn't put his name, because quite often it was his name that appeared on these notices, that's probably why he didn't put his name on the notice, because he was very conscious that things had gone wrong in Stalingrad, Tunis had all gone wrong for them, etc.
Yeah, some of them by now were beginning to smell the coffee, weren't they?
Yeah, and there's some other things that relate to that, which we'll get to later on. So Nakfus might have been trying to worm his way out of it by the time we get to February 1943 and later on, but he was no angel. He was good enough. I saw this quote in some of the documentation relating to the fact that he had behaved as a war criminal. One of the investigators noted that he was good enough to remind islanders that he deplored the mistreatment of slave workers, but that was the only language they understood. I mean, that's just absolutely shocking.
Crass, to say the least.
but when these people are dying because of it, his so-called this is the treatment that only treatment they understand. I mean, I don't know at what point he made that statement. I suspect it probably wasn't in February 1943, because he was trying to worm his way out of things. But yeah, he was clearly not a very nice man.
So these are the guys that are sort of nominally in charge of the deportations, and Louis Guillemette, who was, as we said before, he's our liaison between the German authorities and our government. Louis Guillemette reports that both Nakfus and also our friend Baron Van Alphus, whose diary will come on stream later in 1943. But the Baron is an influential person in the command structure here. They tried to bargain with Muller for exemptions for...
There were lots of bargaining around exemptions which were granted, not granted, were granted, then were subsequently taken away. So these deportations happened over a number of days. It wasn't just like everybody goes on one day. I think it was there were 3 different days. There were deportations from Jersey, for example. And I think, is it Guillemette? Yeah, Louis Guillemette. He is the only 45 that deported from Jersey. Well, that might have been 45 in one batch, but there were many others that went as well. So he's only receiving partial information. But the Baron's diaries, he did have diaries that predate the ones that are in the published book. For whatever reason, they're not included. I'm not sure if it's just that they no longer exist, or.
But he obviously didn't have enough leverage over Muller.
No,
necessarily. He may have been able to bargain over maybe more than we would ever know. But he's obviously seen to be a relatively influential in the eyes of Guillemette, but we'll get on to his diaries in due course. We mentioned about the people that did get deported. Here, Guillemette writes of 35 people being brought across from Sark for deportation, but 7 were exempted at the last moment on the grounds of ill health. Now, people were undergoing medicals, weren't they, before they were either yes or no, before they were sent?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit last month.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, we talked about last month the fact that the Germans didn't, it was the opinion shopping. Doctor number one says this person's not fit to go. They wheel out what they perceive to be a more compliant doctor to assess the same person. And on occasion, they also said, no, this person's not fit to go. And then they just ignored the doctor's opinion anyway.
Yeah. And also amongst what Louis Guillemette writes about Sark was a couple of things that caught my eye. He writes that amongst the Sark contingent, and listeners should perhaps be reminded that Sark is a very small island off a very small island, and no cars, no asphalt roads or anything like this. So he writes that some of the Sark children had never been off the island of Sark before, and Guillemette is struck by one boy being excited not only to travel on a bus when he arrived in Guernsey, but the thought that he was going to travel on the train made this quite naive little boy very, very excited. And then also, Guillemette finds that amongst the Sark contingent was a widow with 9 children. Guillemette can't find out why this poor woman has been included in the deportation.
Yeah, I mean, that is really odd. The only thing is that perhaps she was under suspicion for somehow of being involved in assisting the commandos during the Basalt raid. We talked about the fact that that there were a number of people that were under suspicion for helping them, who were being pulled backwards and forwards to Guernsey from Sark. So it could have been that. It could have been, I don't know. It's very difficult. The other thing that was born was that this appeared to be the Germans being worried about if they had to withdraw troops from the islands. One of the reasons that they picked on people who'd served in the military in the past was that they perceived that these people would turn out to be leaders of any
yes, of course,
insurrection if that were done. Now, as Ord and Guillemette and various others point out, they had no weapons. There was no way that this could have happened in any case, so it was completely nonsensical. And a lot of these people were very elderly.
Yes.
We're not talking about, it's somebody who left the armed. I mean, obviously there were people that had left the armed forces, 4 or 5 years prior to this, but there weren't very many of those kicking around.
But it's a sort of one size fits all. Eh? If it was possible to happen in a small French town where there could be people that were militarily capable, and there were resistance weapons,
but it doesn't getting weapons. Yeah,
doesn't apply in the Channel Islands. But they wouldn't even nuance that. Eh? If it applies in France, it applies in the Channel Islands.
Now, going back to you mentioned that the young lad from Sark being excited about travelling on a bus and train and things like that. If you've listened to the special that we did with Frank Osier, which was the last episode that went out, Frank, in common with many evacuees, talked about what a bit of an adventure it was going to England and observing things like the Blitz, even though it was happening. I think he said he had something like 6 schools bombed out in the first little while. They was there, which if you're a 9-year-old schoolboy, you probably think's brilliant. But he did say it was a bit of a boy's own adventure, and that's a recurring theme that I've had from people that I've spoken to over the years who were evacuees. It was, going out into the brave new world. It's just stuff they'd only ever seen at the cinema, trains. Just the big cities, anything like that. It was all a bit of an adventure. So yeah, and we talked about that with Jan Markey when he was on, and we were talking about the language. Some of these people didn't come back, or they came back and stayed for a very little period of time because they'd been exposed to a completely different way of life.
Yes, and in fact, that harks back also to what people were saying about the First World War. Many people joined up from the islands because they wanted to see a little bit of the life outside of the islands, and what might happen to them in France was almost secondary. In fact, in the great work of Guernsey literature, the Book of Ebenezer the Page, one of the characters is asked why he's joining up, and he says, well, I get to go on the train again, because he'd been on a train on his honeymoon. And this sort of naivety actually played a part in people wanting to get off the island. But of course, by now, we're talking about a 9-year-old boy, not an adult. But it was a driving factor.
I think the other sad aspect as well was that there were suicides of people that were thinking that they were going to be deported.
Yes.
A couple of people from Zart that we mentioned in the January episode who'd committed suicide because they thought.
So a lot of people from Guernsey, a lot of people from Sark, not so many people from Jersey though.
There were quite a number from Jersey. There were I think it was 3 groups off the top of my head. That in Jersey, there were some slightly different approaches, and again, I think this is partly due to there were quite a lot more of them left in Jersey, because as we talked about way back at the start of this, only about 5,000 people evacuated out of their population. There were 40,000 or whatever. There was also a bit, I don't know if because there were more of them in Jersey, that they felt that they could be a little bit more militant from time to time. So we had the rioting down at the first round of deportations, where the Germans got into a right pickle because they didn't quite know what to do with when faced with the crowd of people that are protesting peacefully about the fact that these people are being shipped off. But then you've got and so, it breaks down, the Germans finally snap and it gets a bit violent. And we end up with various people who getting imprisoned for taking part in that public disorder. And I don't know if it's because there were 40,000 of them versus, a similar number of troops to what there were in Guernsey versus 20,000 in Guernsey, that maybe they felt that they could, they had a better chance of doing that. Also, there were a lot more young men in Jersey because they hadn't all evacuated, early on. There hadn't been the mass evacuations. So you had people that were perhaps, teenagers at the start of the occupation and now becoming, they're 17, 18, 19 years old.
So we're saying the selection process in Jersey was different to what it was in...
No, well, it was different in the terms of what they defined as, we talked about this in the January episode, what they defined as served in the British military, because they didn't count serving in the Jersey militia, unlike in Guernsey where the authorities here did. No, there was a bit more. So what my understanding from reading a number of sources and from talking to people over the years is the number that actually ended up going, the number that were put on lists and were to go from Jersey was a much higher number than actually turned up and went. And there seems to, for whatever reason, have been very little done about people that didn't. I mean, it was a massive risk.
So are we saying people were selected to go and then just didn't turn up
on the day?
Now, why would so many people take the same course and just decide not to go?
Well, again, I think they're potentially more organised because, larger island, larger population. There were perhaps more organised acts of defiance, shall we say?
Almost a sort of soft resistance here. Is what we're saying?
Yeah, it's defiance, isn't it?
Defiance.
And from various accounts, it appears that not everyone turned up. I've got no numbers which say exactly what the difference was, but it would appear from it's not just one source; it's a number of sources.
So what we're saying is the word went round,
and people just didn't go on the basis. Let's see what happens if we don't turn up.
Yeah. So we're advising you not to go, and so the amount of people that did turn up possibly either were too afraid to obey the suggestion that they shouldn't go, or hadn't been spoken to in the first place.
If nobody turned up, then that would have been a wholly different thing. But it seems that there were a relatively large number that managed to get away.
That's really interesting.
Get away with not turning up. Yeah. I suspect if that had happened, if you tried that in Guernsey, you'd have been a bit out of luck because it was much more manageable for the Germans to be able to come and get you.
Yes, and so the mix of people, the mix of type, that's really interesting. So we're saying there are more people in Jersey more prone to defiance than they were in Guernsey because of the ages and the sex that they were.
There's so many different factors.
Yes, lots of variables.
I mean, there was an active communist party for starters.
Exactly. I was going to come on to that.
And various things like that. But also just, by having that extra volume of population, it
is a tipping point.
You reach that point where perhaps you feel a little bit more emboldened. We go back to the fact that there were a lot younger men. We've touched on this in terms of how it might impact escapes, in terms of, the tragedy of some of the escapes from Jersey where, people died and they often tended to be youngsters. They were in their teens or early 20s. And how, we all remember how we did stupid stuff when we were teenagers and we felt, because you felt like you were invincible, you'd not quite got around to getting common.
Well, you speak for yourself, mate.
Well, but you were less risk averse.
Yeah, of course.
In modern terminology, I guess you would say you were less risk averse as a teenager than perhaps you were. I mean, some of the people in Jersey that got, for example, in the protests and whatever, they took great risks. Where I can think of one account where the teenager saw a woman being attacked by a German soldier in Jersey as part of this protest thing. He was hitting her, I think it was with the butt of his rifle or something like that, as she was cowering in a doorway. And this chap was, I think he was 16 at the time. He went up for this German they'd all fixed their bayonets before they started trying to deal with the crowd, and he got a bayonet through his thigh. And managed to escape, but was caught because he'd left his bicycle there, and all the bicycles were registered. So they caught up with him a few days later and ended up in prison. So there was an element of that perhaps they were slightly more emboldened. It's something I really need to look at in a lot more detail. I mean, also the fact the island's slightly bigger, and the perhaps was this. Well, I don't know if people felt that it was more possible to do things, so there were a lot more escaped slave workers that were hidden in Jersey. Yeah,
and remained at large as well.
Yeah, and in many cases remained at large throughout the occupation. But I digress somewhat. But I just thought that was an interesting point, that not everybody turned up.
I like some of the people that Lesotho identifies as possibly being on the list. I like this one about here. A local dentist who let his feelings get the better of him and punched a German in the nose and had to be restrained from repeating the performance at yesterday's gathering. So there were some interesting characters in Jersey, nonetheless, and they were being picked up. Another one here who worked in a German hotel and peeled the potatoes too thickly, and that was regarded as being sabotage.
Yeah, absolutely. No, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of people arrested in Jersey they had a lot of political prisoners in Jersey that were taken from the local populace. In fact, quite famously, there's a photograph of some of the political prisoners that were released at the end of the occupation from Jersey. There's a group of them there, but there is a list of political prisoners that were taken in Jersey.
And as Nick mentioned earlier, and this is a really important point, is that there was an active Jersey Communist Party, or Communist Party of Jersey, which is
absolutely
amazing to think of now.
Yeah, it was just different times.
Yeah, but and highlighted the difference between the islands. I'm not saying that for the reasons of being divisive at all, but the two islands did have different outlooks even then. And different mechanics, the way they operated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just down to things like the different demographic of the population, different size of the population.
Yeah.
Were things that different size of the island. I mean, if you were going to go on the run in Jersey, you had almost double the size of island in which you could potentially hide out.
Yeah.
So that's you've got more scope for doing that. So Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, it's an interesting subject.
I need to look at that in a lot more detail.
I'm sorry, if I could just now come back to some of the other diarists talking about deportees, because they do throw up quite a lot of interesting sort of granular facts here. Is one of our regular diarists, Mr. Sovery, he reports on the fact that the rectors of both the Vale and St Sampson's parishes were to be deported. Now, Vale and St Sampson's parishes in Guernsey are the two northern parishes. However, the rector of St Sampson's, which then was a Mr. Frossard, was granted an exemption at the 11th hour because Mr. Frossard will be able to serve both St Sampson's and Vale parishes' religious needs, and the other rector, whose name I forgot to write down, but he didn't get an exemption, and he went. And the other thing, Nick, reading Mr. Sovery's reports, it's very sad because he, in his diary entries for 1943, he's just starting to talk about the effect of the illness that would regretfully carry him off before the liberation, but that's a sort of side issue.
Yeah, indeed. And Ambrose Robin, who we regularly refer to, whose unpublished diary, he's at a loss to understand, and just to remind listeners, he's also involved in the government, and he is at a loss to understand how they've come up with this plan as to who is to be deported. He talks about the non-combatant rectors, being Frossard and James, and also the Reverend Frost and several others. How he's like, how have they been caught in this? And then he says about, but there are some people I'm not really very surprised about. Roe the grower of the Friquet and young Browning of Ponche Farm are not surprising. Now, I don't know. I suspect that's probably because they've been troublemakers in the eyes of the Germans, and we talk about this. Lesotho talks about this in Jersey as well. Basically, once you've got a black mark against your name, it's there forever as far as the Germans are concerned, and they'll find something. If they can't get you for what they thought you've done, they'll get you for something else later on, and you're a marked man effectively. And this kind of ties in a bit as well with, we see that diarists here and in Jersey refer to the fact that in February 43, there's a massive uptick in trying to find radios.
Yes, yeah.
And people are getting into trouble for that. And it's interesting that it's across both islands. It's clearly an organised campaign to try and stop people from finding out what the hell's going on out in the outside world. Yeah, I mean, other things around.
Well, sorry, I just want to also come to, there's an interesting thing here, because which sort of emphasised, some of you said emphasised it for me, the fact that it's almost as if they were afraid of people that were orators, or people that could talk to crowds. Correct. And things. And Violet Carey, who talks about her husband being exempted, which was, as you can imagine, a huge relief. James Carey, her husband, had, as a young man, had left Guernsey and set up a ranch in Canada. He'd been engaged to Violet before he left and returned to marry her and settle on Guernsey. Now, James Carey was the president of the Guernsey Farmers Association, so he was quite used to talking to large and holding the attention of large bodies of men, and Guernsey farmers were quite a breed apart. He was also a member of various government committees. So Violet writes, I'm unsure as to why he might have been considered for deportation. He'd been in the army as well. But this is a man that could hold a crowd. This is a man that could have organised thoughts in a time of stress. So you're right, Nick. I think they were looking to say who could be regarded as people that could rally others to a cause, and we're sort of almost as if they're weeding them out, isn't it?
Ambrose Robin is convinced that is the case.
Yeah.
He notes in his diary, if the garrison's going to be reduced to a very small number, which is potentially because they want to boost the Eastern Front, bearing in mind we had about 30,000 Germans here, if they're going to reduce the garrison, they're worried about people who had such a voice, who could be potential leaders of any insurrection, etc. But Robin quite rightly points out, what are we to do without weapons if that is the case? So they're just they've always been afraid of public gatherings, and you had to get permits, and that carried out throughout the occupation. And that's why they didn't like organisations like the Oddfellows, the Freemasons, etc. And the Salvation Army. They just, even the blooming Scouts. I mean, What were they expecting? A load of scouts gonna
they
lead
might
some
have been equating him to the Hitler Youth. You know what?
But anyway, it was just absolutely crazy. But James Carey was also, he was on the list because he had been a regular officer in the British Army,
exactly,
not just in the militia, and he served until March 1919. He was a lieutenant in the British Army. Now, at the same time as we're getting all of this stuff around deportations happening now, we've also got people are starting to receive Ambrose Robin notes that, there's a batch of letters from evacuees that's been received. It's the first batch of letters that are being received, and it explains, that they're being treated okay.
Well, these are the people that went in September 43.
Yeah, so this is, you remember when we were talking in January 43 episode, it's really difficult. You don't know what's happening because what's happened to these people, you've had no communication. There was some general communication that the Germans put about that they got there okay. Well, do you believe them? I mean, on my tour yesterday with Joe May, when I talked briefly about the control of the newspapers and some visitors from Canada. There was a group of them, and they thought it was absolutely hilarious that the front page of the Guernsey Press was known as the Grange Lodge Times because that was the German headquarters. And they thought that was quite amusing and also quite distressing that, people just didn't know what was going on.
So I just sort of want to sort of tie up the deportations of 43. What does seem to be happening as well is that people that were sent, there was a number of people that were sent away despite all of the requests for exemption, etc. And after 10 days or so, some of them started to come back, didn't they?
Well, no, approximately 10 of them came back, but they didn't get back till February 43. So they were sent in September. They've been quite a while.
So some of the people that came back not long after the 43 contingent went were actually people that had gone in 42.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if they came back before the 43 contingent had gone or not. I don't have that date to hand, but they were coming back in February 43. There were a few of them that came back. And now,
because I've just got here. Savory reports on his acquaintance, Mr. Cross, along with 5 others who have been returned due to ill health. Gnet reports this number to be about 10 men returning. So people did come back, just wondering if they were 42 or actually the 43 contingent. But the point is that people were returned to the island, weren't they?
Yeah, no, it's people from 42. It's not 43 people that are returning. Now, what happened was, and this is a slightly bizarre situation, so you'd have someone who was ill, would have somebody who had also been deported, would travel back with them, because obviously getting back in 43 was somewhat problematic because the Allies were bombing the living daylights out of, occupied France, particularly things like the railway systems, etc.,
yes.
and Germany. So, the wasn't a simple journey to get back in the first place. Then they had the hazardous crossings and stuff like that. So they were accompanied by somebody able-bodied would come back with them, who then had to do the reverse trip.
Yeah.
And go
back to captivity.
Go back to captivity.
That
must have been absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
You get all the way back home.
They actually came to the island. They didn't just go to St. Malo.
No. They came to the island and were usually here for, there are accounts of them being here for like a week or whatever, and then they get shoved on a ship back to...
I'd never heard of that before. Interesting.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And that was because that was the only way they could deal with them. But that must have been absolutely gutting. I mean, obviously you get some relief because you can tell your friends and relatives what it's really like in the camps.
Well, we might be getting more food in the camp than you're getting.
Well, yeah, exactly. So it is very, very difficult.
Okay, so I'd like to... There was lots of other things going on in the island at the time. There was an outbreak of typhus, which seemed to be centering on slave workers or OT workers in St. Peter Port. And the Germans really did take this very seriously, didn't they? Yeah, they did. They were very worried about it getting out into the wider population and amongst their troops, of course.
So we talked a little bit about this in the last episode. There were various outbreaks, and they just shut complete areas off of some people where these people were,
and posted guards outside the houses.
Yeah, German soldiers were also confined to their billets for certain periods. They were allowed to go out on duty, but other than that, a lot of social activity was basically stopped.
And also, there was a lot of Germans that issued another blizzard of orders.
Yeah, Lesotho in Jersey talks about this. He's just like the most, talks about in the 15th of February, there's the most awe-inspiring document with death penalties and jails splashed all over the place. I've seen this in the papers, absolutely loads of things. Now, a lot of them are repeats. It's like
chock some repeats out.
It's like watching, the BBC or whatever, and they've picked up, popular, although the orders weren't popular, the popular TV series, and they might show it again 6 months later or whatever. Well, a lot of these orders had come out in December, but there were some new ones.
Their greatest hits.
It was almost like the greatest hits of 1940 to 42.
Reissued in 43.
Reissued in 43, along with some newbies, just keep the band going.
Yeah.
They've got so many in there, and Lesotho notes that it covers a lot of stuff already, but it's got some new stuff in there. So VD becomes a punishable offence.
Yeah, I just double-checked with Nick. It does mean venereal disease.
Yes, it
became a punishable offence.
The Germans actually, they viewed it as, people were basically committing an act of war if they were deliberately passing. But there were some people that did deliberately, who fraternised, who ended up, unfortunately, catching such a disease and then decided, well, if I've caught it, I might as well pass it on to as many Germans as, and there were court cases around it. We'll come to another one of those in a moment. And, it also legalised the system of general confiscation as a punishment for any misbehaviour. And Lesotho quite rightly observes, this is rather late because they've been doing it for years. The confiscating your assets in the event that you or your family are up to no good. In some of the cases of people who escaped and whatever, they basically cleared out their house of goods, furniture, everything. And there's also, one of the orders is a sort of vague promise of retribution for any insults to a member of the occupying force or one of its employees. Oh, bless them! They're going to get upset because you say nasty words.
I think the
you say nasty words about the Nazis, and they go and have a little cry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the current vernacular, they would be described as snowflakes.
Oh yeah, it's hard to associate that with being a Nazi. Never mind.
Without mentioning, going back to this venereal disease, without mentioning names, there was, you've included in our notes the court case that actually went.
Yeah,
this is reported in a local paper.
Yeah,
I will mention one name is Dr. Cambridge as the person that's being called as a witness. He was our family doctor in the early 60s. But so a lady has been charged that being aware of the fact she was suffering venereal disease had not been pronounced cured by the medical practitioner. She failed to turn up at some of the tests.
She failed to turn up for her compulsory tests, etc. in December 42. Having gone for the first one, she said she'd been ill and whatever, but it didn't wash anything with the court. And she was, kept under, basically taken into custody and kept under observation.
Yeah, so no data protection in those days, mate.
No, it's all printed in the press with your full name. So she got £5 fine or 1 month's imprisonment.
I mean, £5 fine, week's wages?
No, more than that.
More than that.
More than a week's wages.
Yeah.
I can't remember what that is in real money now.
Or maybe close to a month, I think.
Yeah.
Depends on what you did, of course.
Yeah, well, exactly. So yeah, there was that as well. I mean, Lesotho sums up the orders that bandied around, and I think he does it in a very... I said this to the people on the tour yesterday. I really like him as a diarist. I rate him because
He's got a wry sense of humour, hasn't he?
He has got a sense of humour and sees funny things in the face of adversity. Everyone's facing some absolutely appalling times, but he just manages to find something. And some of the analogies that he uses. So he talks about the resemblance of our present life in its unreality is like Alice in Wonderland. It grows every week, and we have been the parallel to the Queen's edict of off with his head in the off to Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just think it's a brilliant and quite powerful analogy.
It was. Yeah. Moving on, we've got an account here, Nick, poor man, his son dies in his father's arms after a mine explosion. This is what's quite appalling case. I'd seen this myself, but would you just talk us through this one here?
This is a 17-year-old lad out at Torterville who died when a mine exploded. Now, Torterville headland was fairly heavily mined, as were a lot of the areas around German gun batteries, etc., and along the coast to prevent landings, particularly as they were worried about counter attacks or the islands were trying to be retaken or whatever. But you had to temper that with the fact that people were trying to find food. They were desperate for food. This young man, Alfred Gallion, as I say, he was from Torterville. He was aged 17 years old. He died when a mine exploded whilst he was armouring. Another member of the party, Mr. Charles Darrington, was severely injured during the course of it. The coroner censured the men for their venture into the minefields, stating that they were entirely to blame. Now, they were marked. They were well marked out, these minefields. So, but clearly the desperation for doing this. They arranged this on the Sunday night, and on Monday went through a heavily mined area to which they had to climb over 2 wire fences and descended 60 or 70 feet further down. One was killed and the other was injured. They'd gone through barbed wire fence. I mean, it's no wonder he was killed, because when he trod on the mine, he was actually blown over the cliff. It's a very, very sad case, and sadly not unusual. And there were so many cases of people who did go into minefields because they were trying to get through them, or they simply didn't believe that there were actually mines in the minefields in an attempt to go and get food.
Yeah, with this particular case, the coroner said that the 3 men had no business being where they had gone and should have known better. And then the deceased, who died from his wounds in the explosion, and the verdict was returned of death from misadventure. And, starvation, or rather hunger, more accurately, notwithstanding, they shouldn't have done what they did, and they took the risk, and they ultimately, one of them paid the ultimate price. Milk trouble. This is in Guernsey. Jurat Curtier-Lepelle, a name that comes up quite often.
He was a very busy Jurat. That's all I can say.
He was, and he features in Ebenezer Le Page. But that's another story.
He's all over the Guernsey press here in court cases throughout the occupation.
This is a lady that withheld milk supplies.
We talked a little bit about this in the previous couple of episodes, cracking down on milk supplies and the civilian government doing it, because there was concern that some of the farmers were not playing the game and were misappropriating milk rather than delivering it for it to be shared out fairly. This one, Philomena Lanuri, 74 years old, a farmer from Maison de Haut Kings Mills, Cassel, was charged with failing to deliver all her cow's milk produced except that which was permitted to be retained to the milk depot. And again, this was over just after the Christmas period, and members of her family had drunk as much milk as they desired, and she'd not sold any other milk unto the dairy, so they were trying to mitigate the claims. Again, this lady got a £5 fine. It wasn't confined just to Guernsey, though. There was a Jersey milk farmer fined for milk adulteration. He was skimming the milk, so he was pretending to send full cream milk to the dairy, but not, and also selling 5 litres per day other than to a ration to customers, which he wasn't allowed to do. There was another Jersey court case where the farmer was actually And it seems that the judge in this case was particularly annoyed because the farmer was feeding the milk to his pigs.
Yeah. In fact, with this one here in Jersey, the milk adulteration, the actual bailiff remarked that the court was sorry it could not inflict a heavier fine on the adulteration under the audience because of this thinning of the milk. So it was taken very, very seriously.
Well, but people were, suffering serious illness due to the lack of being able to get milk, and just people, just keeping the milk. And I talked about the, Jerseyman getting in trouble because he was feeding milk to his pigs. Well, we mentioned this a little bit previous. There was a lot of unauthorised pig killing going on, and there was a massive crackdown on it. There were a lot of cases heard in February 1943, which were related to the run-up to the Christmas period and over the Christmas period, when, unsurprisingly, people were looking to supplement their meat ration. We talked about that when we did December 1942, in terms of some people had a somewhat better Christmas dinner than others because pigs had accidents and died. But this again is, there's a whole group of people here that had been defrauding the Essential Commodities Committee by killing a pig illegally, etc., and making false statements. They'd basically done this fairly brazenly because they killed the pig in a greenhouse and cut it up there in an attempt to try and get away with making it look like a burglary, so that the pig had actually been killed by someone else who had then ritted the carcass off.
So it was contrived burglary, effectively.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah. And some of the party here were fined £5 each, and 2 weeks in prison. There was a Vale farmer also got in trouble for supplying sugar, and I remember looking at this case. Now, he had been suspected of robbery, but basically what happened was this chap had found, almost like the sweepings of flour and stuff like that, bits of sugar that had been on the floor and whatever had leaked out, and had swept it all up and bagged it up and was then flogging it on. And obviously people weren't too fussed about the fact that it might have dust and other stuff in it, because they could, do something with it.
Okay, looking at the wider world, our Reverend Ord, reports that a German newspaper had, in his words, fallen into his hands this week. Ord, I remind you, it's very well connected with members of certain members of the German higher-ranking officers or middle-ranking officers, on the basis that he was a German speaker and a reverend, and many German officers confided their thoughts to him. So he'd obviously been past the newspaper, and Ord notices that the endless obituary notices say something like, died at Stalingrad or killed at Stalingrad. And Ord comments, ever and always Stalingrad. The great feeling that Stalingrad really was a massive turning point in the war.
Yeah.
And he also goes on to say that he had heard on an account of a BBC broadcast. So he's obviously listening to the wireless. I think it was the Chilcot family that had the wireless. Ord relays that an RAF pilot claimed on a recent raid on Lorient that he had been told to fly around the island to cheer people up. So is there much credence to this, Nick?
I don't know. I've not heard that story before, but I mean, they often, we've talked about this before, they often, on the way back from a raid, if they found themselves over the islands or deliberately over the islands, I can't imagine that they would particularly, unless they were conducting a raid attacking the islands, you're not really going to fly over them, because it was well known that there was quite a large density of flak could be put up, and other anti-aircraft fire from here.
Little bit of light propaganda, I think. So,
I mean, he may have been, it depends what height you were doing it and stuff like that. But, maybe he was told to do that. Yeah. Who knows? But, it certainly would have cheered the population up, because you just have to look at the accounts in various diaries, etc. But people would talk about it. They're really pleased. And as we know in Jersey, our friend Lesotho complains about not being bombed enough by the RAF. Yeah. So, yeah, entirely possible that this might have happened, not least because aside from cheering up the local population, it would have put the up the Germans, because they were very nervous at this point. And there were attacks where German soldiers got killed by machine gun attacks, just random aircraft attacking.
Ord also relates that he's giving a sermon in a church in St. Peter Port, and a German in uniform attends communion that Ord is taking and comes up to receive the sacrament, and Ord talks to him in German and then comments how the rest of the congregation had treated this German officer, or this German in uniform, as if he were one of their own people. So it was almost like a common ground, neutral ground. The man in question, it seems, the German in question, spoke with Ord later and admitted he was longing for the war to be over. And I think by this time there was a general feeling amongst some of the Germans, certainly the Germans that spoke with Ord, that they wanted the war to be over. And I think they were just as happy for the British or the Allies to have won.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, now also on the 12th of February 1943, there was a fatality, RAF fatality, Nick?
Yeah, we talked about Whirlwinds operating in the area in the last couple of episodes, and this is no different. A Whirlwind, that's a twin-engined aircraft that was used in a sort of ground attack role as well as fighter role, and they had what they called the whirly bomber, where they'd adapted it to bomb things. This was from 263 Squadron, and on the 12th of February 1943, an aircraft operated by Flight Sergeant Williams took off, along with Flying Officer Philip Harvey, DFC, who was flying another aircraft. They went on a rhubarb raid to France. They attacked a couple of trains with cannon fire. Now, these things had 4 cannon in the nose, 420mm cannon. That's 2 centimetres. That's really going to ruin your day, even if you're in a relatively armoured train. The Williams's aircraft P7052 was hit by flak from the train and was observed to ditch successfully in the water. Now, I think it's recorded as being about 30 miles away from Guernsey. It appears he went down somewhere between Guernsey and Carteret from the information that I've been able to deduce. Now, Flying Officer Harvey returned to RAF Warnwell, where they'd taken off from. He got 10 in the morning and did the Walrus seaplane. So I'll put some pictures out so people can envisage what these look like. I'll put them in a link to them in the show notes. So Walrus was a seaplane which was used for rescuing airmen along with other roles. He insisted that he would personally go and escort that in his aircraft. Sadly, the weather had turned, making it absolutely impossible for the Walrus to make a rescue attempt. And they had a further attempt later on in the afternoon, but of course, with the tides running and things like that, there was no trace of the pilot. He had been seen getting into a dinghy, so what happened to him, we unfortunately don't know. He's commemorated on the memorial here in Guernsey at the airport, but also in Runnymede on the RAF memorial there. As a sort of slightly sad postscript as well, 23-year-old Flying Officer Philip Harvey, who was the gentleman in the other aircraft, he was listed as missing, believed killed on Saturday, the 17th of April 1943, flying a very similar operation over Caen, France, just 2 months later.
Okay, so yeah, very sad. Williams, it looks like, gets into his dinghy and is lost at sea, essentially.
Essentially, yeah, it would appear that the case. I mean, at the time, they would have probably still listed him as missing because he'd been seen going into his dinghy, and then later on they couldn't find him. There was every chance that he might have been picked up by the Germans, but sadly, that turned out not to be the case.
Well, such is war, and brave young men, which should never be forgotten. Okay, so that sort of concludes February 1943, but as always, we have some parish notices.
We've got some important ones. Now, I promised I would mention this to the Imperial War Museum. We mentioned it briefly before. We've mentioned it on our socials as well, and it's on the Imperial War Museum social media as well as their website. We are taking part in Podcast Live Festival that they're running on the 1st of November 2025 at the Imperial War Museum in London. there were a number of podcasts taking part in this. We're really pleased to have been invited along to include Channel Islands occupation history in this. We doing the curated their Holocaust exhibition at the museum, and with him, if Paul did so out or listen to. Great podcast going along, but far too many to list, but I will put them in the show notes. There's the likes of History Rage. Paul Bavell will be there. I'm sure many people will be familiar with that. If you haven't, do go check out History Rage. We've got For You, the War is Over. They're going to be there as well. They do podcasts about escapes, and they've done a lot of work on the Great Escape and things like that. Absolutely fascinating. They talk to surviving relatives of escapers and various other bits and pieces, and many, many more podcasts. So it's going to be a great day out. I hope if you are in the London area at the time, you can come and join us. When I was talking at We Have Ways Fest in the UK last week, people were mentioning to me that they were planning coming along. So I'll share the link to that. But I think the cost is £40 to attend the podcast live festival. I think that's the charge that the Imperial War Museum make, which for a whole day out actually I think is pretty reasonable. So yeah, as I say, we'll be recording in front of a live audience. Yeah,
I'm staggered that we never thought that we would sort of be invited to things like this when we started our humble little podcast.
Indeed. Well, I've had a few hundred people listening to me at We Have Waste Fest at the History Festival last week as well, which was great, and some really, really good questions. I love it when people ask lots of questions around our history, because they're becoming more and more interested. Quite a few people also stopped me over the course of the weekend to say that they hadn't planned on coming to the Channel Islands before because they didn't know what there was to come and see. And I talked to them about history. Don't mention it, but I talked about stuff not related to the occupation, but in terms of things that, other aspects of our history that they might like to come and see as well. So hopefully we'll get a few of them over next year.
And on that note of talks and other aspects of our island history, I myself embark on a series of talks, monthly talks, that will take in, as I say, elements of local history. The first talk is Tuesday the 14th of October at 7 p.m. to St Martin's Parish Hall, and the aim is, the commitment is to give a talk in the second Tuesday of every month up to and including April. And if you want to know or have further details about that, you can get hold of Keith at guernseywalkingtours.com. Send me an email, and indeed you can send one to occupied@gnetradio.com if you want to inquire on the talks. On the 25th of this month, which is next week, I shall be taking part in an outside broadcast with Jim Delbridge. And that's for broadcast at 11 a.m.-ish on Sunday the 28th. That's next Sunday as we record. And I'll be describing and talking about the events that took place when we were raided by German forces on the evening of the 28th of June 1940. And then Nick and I will be taking part of giving a talk at the Channel Island Occupation Society Christmas tea.
In December. That seems frighteningly close.
Yeah, well, it is. So that was Sunday the 21st at the Villiers Hotel, and Nick and I will be talking about things that have sort of cropped up in the making of this podcast, if odd things that have yet unresolved or resolved after a fashion. So
yeah, and also things that people we can include a few things in there as well that people find quite surprising. Well, we've been talking to them on tours and things like that. Or even quite a few people who actually know an awful lot about the occupation, and we've found something in an archive or whatever, and they're very surprised by what we've found.
Yep. And a thank you as well to Charlie Roberts, who continues to send us wonderful emails, and congratulations to you, Charlie, on your recent university success. Much, much more to come, I'm sure.
Oh, I've just thought of something else as well that I need to mention. When I was at We Have Way Fest, it was great to see there was a contingent from Jersey that were there.
Very good.
Who came along to the talk. I had a good chat with some of them, and also a few others have been in touch who weren't weren't there subsequently. And so we've got some scope to get a few of those folks on to talk about some Jersey aspects of the occupation. I'm just going to get back in touch with them and try and nail down some topics that we might be able to cover, which will be perhaps slightly more Jersey-based.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's it. Next program, I don't think we've got a special coming up. Next program will be March 1943.
Indeed, in March 1943. Gosh, we're speeding towards the end of the occupation.
I don't know about
that. with all the people that keep coming forward with, and please do keep coming forward. If you've got a story to tell us, or something that you want us particularly to talk about, absolutely get in touch.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Just the slightest thing can solve many, many mysteries.
Indeed. All right, I suppose we better shut up now, Keith.
Okay. Thank you very much for listening. We really do appreciate it. So it's goodbye from Keith and
goodbye from Nick.
Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.